Hello, my students. This is Beth, and here is the outline I have made for teaching and learning how to write a research paper online, trying to make it as smooth and clear as possible, and we'll see how that goes. I'm going to go over the outline of the units first, and then preach a little bit inside of the first unit. We'll get as far as thesis statements today, and going over the assignment of the paper. Hopefully this will be useful to everybody, not just my students, even though some of the specifics will change. I'm actually going to read out loud some of what I wrote, which feels really silly, but also perhaps the smoothest way to do this. In reality, practiced upper-level research performs all of the following steps at once, woven into your preferred order or in rapid succession. So the following is a broken down, slowed down set of steps that many pursuing college-level research consider vital. After a couple years of practice, you'll be weaving all of these threads together in your sleep in a process personalized to fit you and much faster. But here they are to be highlighted and learned as separately as possible as stepping stones. So really, these are all woven together in reality. I do a lot of these at the same time, even as I'm looking for sources. I'm also thinking about the reliability. I am getting ready to write about the math. I'm wondering if my writing about the statistics that I found inside primary sources are going to fit my thesis statement, which I have already laid out in an outline that changes and that I draft with as I come across new information. That said, in the beginning, you have to do these steps separately and not completely in one order because they are all recursive and cyclical, but we're going to take a look at them separately so that you can start weaving them together. I've made 5 units that cover most of the theory, like how to divide and analyze information until you have an angle, and the concrete steps will be sprinkled throughout, like making an outline to reflect main points, subcategories, and details that match your angle, and then emphasized all together at the end in the format of your own research paper. Cool. I know how to scroll while I'm recording a video of my screen. It's gonna be fine. Okay, the overview, Unit 1, is what we are going to do after I walk you through the online outline of research in general. So today, in a moment here, we are going to obsess about writing is rarely just this beautiful art form or technically correct exercise or worksheet that is given to you by English professors. Some of us love to do this. I would love if it helped you to learn something by giving you just a quiz or a worksheet. I would love if you wanted to talk about which poetry is just beautiful or which fiction just really moved you, but that is rarely what writing ends up being for everybody else. It is usually at the college level what you have to use to prove that you understand material that was taught to you by a professor. And then out in the real world, it's usually what you have to prove to a boss or employer that has asked you to go do something and needs you to understand the complex pieces. Rarely does another professor or another employer look at you and say, wow, I think that's written really beautifully, but I'm not sure about the content. Usually they will only focus on the content and they won't comment on your aesthetics. They will say, this is terrible. I think you don't understand what you're talking about, as opposed to, maybe we should work on your writing some more. They want you to have already done that. So that's part of the reason that we lean into writing research at all. It's your way not of just expressing yourself beautifully or correctly, but of making sure that you understand and can reiterate complex information that you have to know in your career field. By the formal final draft, only answers should be asserted, not questions raised. A lot of people refer to research questions, and these are great. It is wonderful if you want to brainstorm by asking yourself questions, especially the most complex questions like how and why something is happening. but by the end of a research paper, you need to be giving the answers. I know this also sounds like when some speech teachers and some fans of MLA English writing tell you to put a hook in, right? Like an interesting question at the beginning. That kind of only works in AP journalistic style. And it's really casual and informal, and it doesn't work well in formal research. You have to be giving out your answers. And those answers are often called your thesis statement. And so thesis statement or statements, usually as narrowed down and specified as possible, save the rest for subtopics and details, are your argument, right? You have to have an argument or a statement or an answer, and it doesn't have to be super combative. It doesn't have to be, a topic that will end with everyone in tears and fisticuffs and everything else. It just has to be an angle because there is bias in almost everything. Almost nothing is objective. It's just your job to declare which angle you're taking and then to back yourself up with proof in the rest of the paper. Okay. And then in Unit 2, we're going to look at division and analysis, which is what almost all academic reading and writing turns out to be. It just means that you divide things into pieces and you look for the meaning. You go looking for an examination that really gets at the most important pieces of the topic. It's why in biology we dissect things rather than just looking at things from the outside. And plenty of our examples will be from biology. Some of these easiest ones, like compare and contrast, are really familiar, right? You've likely been asked to use compare and contrast for virtually every writing topic you've ever done, and it can accidentally get a little bit basic, especially because you'll usually be comparing and contrasting more than two things. It will not usually be two things that you're holding together. It'll be 3, 4, dozens, and you'll have to say what they have in common and what they have different between them, because neither one works by itself. Definition and classification is another version of division and analysis that's really important, especially at upper levels, because you have to take topics that are really important in your field, like what does, I actually am struggling to come up with business terms. I only know things like biology and history and psychology. But, redefining evolution, redefining what counts as war or peace or independence, and then you end up giving examples of the thing that you've redefined. I suppose to take layperson business terms, you could help us understand what some of those basic terms mean or argue that they should mean something different. What is a gross national product? What is operating in the black? Can you define it? Or, do you have a bone to pick with a major definition in your field? And then cause and effect ends up being one of the most important. And it ends up answering questions of why and how. So, why did this super important thing happen, whether it's, in particle physics or if it's out of history class? Why is something happening? We will obsess about sources. I'm going to leave that almost completely for that unit because there's so much to it, but we'll look at what's primary and secondary for sources, and we'll look at what some of the red and yellow flags are, in order for you to be able to start fact checking your own materials. And that fact tends to be kind of a meaningless word because all fact and nonfiction is backing up assertions and angles with evidence, and that even if you're finding evidence and sources that are relatively reliable, they won't be perfect, and you'll have to make exceptions and just know what is happening within your sources. Then The favorite for some, the least favorite for the rest of us, will be authors have to read and write math. We'll talk about correlation and causation. We'll do a little bit about sample sizes, and we'll look at what is peer review, and we'll look at what is statistical significance and p-value, and how can we talk about results that are important, which will have to do with the primary sources. If primary sources are often peer reviewed when they're very high quality, then we have to be able to talk correctly about what those peer-reviewed research studies were telling us. You know, is this a reasonable sample size? Is it correlation or causation? Can I say one thing is causing the other thing? Especially if I want to do the style of division and analysis that depends on answering why something is happening. So we will do those. Let's switch over to our first unit of Soapbox. Welcome to the overview soapbox. Writing is rarely just a beautiful art form or technically correct grammar and punctuation exercise. It's much, much, much more often proof to other experts that you understand the complex information at a high level. Whether this is a peer, a coworker, a professor for another class who is asking you to repeat the information you've already learned, if a boss or employer has sent you off to explore something, they're not going to look at the writing that comes back very often and talk about your writing. It's either going to reflect that you do or do not understand what they've been talking about or asking about. It is very rare that anybody will say, "This is terrible, we should work on your writing." It is very rare that somebody would say, "Oh, what beautiful writing, I don't care about the content." It is almost always the opposite, where somebody will say, "This is great, you clearly understand the topic," or "This is terrible, you know nothing about this." They're not usually looking for how beautifully or aesthetically you've done it. This is why essay exams tend to be really common. And it is also true for emails and presentations and proposals, anything you're going to want to do in your professional life. They really check for the complex information, and going with that complex information, again, revealing that it is not about just the aesthetics, that the aesthetics are the basics. Critical thinking and communication skills about critical thinking are really high on the list of qualities that employers look for. Maybe I will click on one of these for you. Top 5 skills employers look for. Look at critical thinking. Critical thinking and problem solving is so high up here. Critical thinking and problem solving. If you can't go out just like you will for research and find amazing sources, find complex information, and do some problem solving and understanding of that information, if you can't do that well enough for a research paper, what are the chances that you can do that in your field out on the job or in another class for material that you don't understand perfectly, especially when it is being handed to you to learn largely by yourself in the middle of a plague, completely online? Hopefully teamwork and collaboration will be something we have been working on in discussion. Professionalism and strong work ethic. Good luck out there, though I hope work ethic has come into play here. Oral and written communication skills. There are a whole bunch of lists out here that tell you what things employers are looking for, and oral and written communication skills are really, really frequent. And it's really, really likely that if you can write an amazing research paper, if you can read a whole book and understand what was being said, chances are you are also capable of handling really complex information that is required out in your career field, right? That if you understand something you have read well enough to explain it to somebody else over a conference call, you have a really good understanding of it. So again, these communication skills aren't just like, wow, I really like your speaking voice in that meeting. It is much more likely that it reflects on your ability to understand the information. Also, feel free to take a bunch of speech classes and rhetoric classes and then tell them that your English professor rolled her eyes about ancient, Greco-Roman rhetoric styles and ethos, pathos, and logos. Because if we're told to use ethos and then told not to do ad hominem attacks, nonsense. But still, oral communication, important. Take your speech classes. There are a couple more of those that you can look at if you like, but critical thinking and written and oral communication skills clearly come into play in a research paper, and it's part of why everybody will ask you not just to write research papers, but will ask you to make presentations, will ask you to write an email to the board of directors, will ask you to write an essay exam, because those skills are so important to your understanding, not just the beauty of what you're saying. Okay, by the formal final draft, only answers should be asserted, not questions raised, even if the most complex questions of how and why drive the research and the search for solid sources. Okay, so let's look at this little link here. I think that asking these questions is really, really useful as brainstorming. I think that brainstorming is something that everyone does vaguely differently. Some people like to, go right to an outline or start drafting sentences and paragraphs, but I think that a more complex way of getting at what do you want to start drafting about is to ask yourself a bunch of questions first. So often the research questions that you're thinking about are really important to making your paper complex. They just happen in brainstorming, not in the paper itself. By the time you're drafting the paper, you have answers to the questions that you researched. Okay, but here is some other options for brainstorming. Again, gets a little bit basic, but if you love to type out full sentences to help yourself understand what you're saying, by all means, have at it. Make sure you're asking yourself questions about the things that come out in your free writing. Break down the top into levels. Like I said, some people like to start with an outline. If you start very, very first thing with an outline, make sure you put plenty of question marks in there and expect that lots of the information you find will have to be amended as you go and find the actual primary sources. Listing, bulleting, absolutely. But again, keep the question marks in there. I would love to stop and obsess about similes, but I won't. I will resist the English nerd desire to stop and tell you all about similes instead of metaphors. Okay. Mapping. If you love doing bubble letters, this is essentially just bullet points with bubble letters and circles and hearts and diagrams or spiders and spider webs, however you like to draw it out. Really, a lot of this is getting down here to the journalistic questions, right? You can brainstorm via journalistic questions. Charts or shapes, purpose and audience. Dictionaries, thesaurus, encyclopedias is that division and analysis style that we're going to get to later. Remember, defining things. Really where we are here is journalistic questions and thinking outside the box, right? It's just make sure you're raising all of the questions. If nobody raised questions before they started finding the answers to research, we would only ever have the same answers. So even if you are finding that you come to some common answers, make sure you're pushing on them with these important questions. If you narrow down to one research question right away, that is completely fine as well. Oh yeah, Duke has a great PDF about taking a major research question So again, I would encourage you to have more that you just narrow down into. And Firefox likes to open their PDFs in an Explorer app, whatever. Here is Duke giving us some ideas about research questions and what makes a good research question. A research question guides and centers your search. I guess in a moment I'm just going to turn around and tell you this is basically you making your thesis statement instead of making a question. But here we go. For instance, the following question is too broad and does not define the segments of the analysis. Why did the chicken cross the road? The question does not address which chicken or which road. It also doesn't address a lot more than that, but I'm going to try not to get stuck nitpicking a chicken crossing the road example. Similarly, the following questions could be answered by a hypothetical internet search. How many chickens crossed Broad Street in Durham, North Carolina on February 6, 2014? Ostensibly, this question could be answered in one sentence and does not leave room for analysis. It could, however, become data for a larger argument. So notice that the reason they're ruling this out is not because it is just nice and specific. It's because it could come down to one sentence, right? It doesn't ask if there is any variation. It's asking for basically one data point. So you'd have to expand this to maybe make a trend about it, or maybe to have multiple data points, or expand this geography. A more precise question might be the following. What are some of the environmental factors that occurred in Durham, North Carolina between January and February 2014 that would cause chickens to cross Broad Street? Absolutely. Again, I'd toss maybe something in here about a trend, right? I would maybe say that would not just cause chickens to cross the road, but talk about if it was an increase, if it was a decrease, if they were dramatic, if they were mild, if it was a complete stopping of chickens crossing the street, if it doesn't happen at all, other time periods or other streets, right? And looking for maybe the direction of the trend. And then notice what are some of the environmental factors is basically saying, why did the chickens cross the road? But it's not leaving it completely open like this up here. It's not this completely open. It's not just asking a basic question like how many. It is going after a why question, which tends to be the most complex information. And then also that they could add what the trend is, if it's an increase or if it's a decrease. And then again, that this is just a question. What you're really going to be aiming at after you start brainstorming these basics is turning it into a statement. So here we have a little preaching about thesis statements. Almost nothing in this world is objective. There is only one's declaring one's angle and main points and then backing it up with proof. Sources and citations come later. The declared angle and answers asserted are often referred to as thesis statement, and the evidence appears as cited sources, and you're writing about those sources. Okay, so virtually nothing is objective, and if it is too objective, it is far too narrowed down. Let's fall back to the PDF for a moment and look at this in terms of objective. Why did the chicken cross the road? Could we make that, is it narrow enough that it even could come close to being backed up with evidence? Or could you take any chicken on any road in any year, in any month, and it'd be just way too expansive to get anywhere close to factual or objective, or they would all be true. They would all be equally true because you would have too much evidence for each one. How many chickens crossed Broad Street in Durham, North Carolina on February 6th, 2014? Assuming that somebody had, counted the chickens and had defined the road and had defined the hours of the day and, had been out there in light and dark equally, the reason they say that this turns into a data point is because this is no longer debatable, so it can't be a thesis statement. It is one of the only things that's objective is something that is completely undebatable, right? Instead of, Galileo describing how or why telescopes worked, the equivalent would be just saying telescopes exist and not getting at any of the how or why, right? This would just be the equivalent of chickens crossed Broad Street in Durham, North Carolina, and it doesn't give us any more information than that. But this is still debatable, and it reveals that there could be a bunch of different answers, and they could all be equally objective or subjective. What are some of the environmental factors that occurred in Durham, North Carolina between January and February? So the reason this will not come down to objective truth and people will have to declare their answers and declare their sources to back them up is because there could be 40, 50, thousands, millions of environmental factors that occurred in Durham, North Carolina, and they would just be showing their proof for their one. If one chicken was being chased by a fox and they had evidence and documentation of that, if they had a trail cam out looking at one chicken being chased by one fox, that is objectively true. Does it make it the only answer for why more or less chickens crossed Broad Street that day? What if somebody else says there was a really strong wind coming from the north, so a lot of chickens who were already in the south had no interest in walking north across the street that day? Maybe that explains some more, and it's objectively true. What if a truckload of chickens was driven across the street, and that counts as crossing? Is the truck the factor? Is the schedule the factor? Is the driver the factor? It's not that any of them are going to be completely untrue and completely disproven. It's just going to be people with really nice sources debating their angle. One of them is going to say, look, the only one of these chickens who truly crossed the road despite the wind is because a fox was chasing them. So the fox is the environmental factor that matters most. Somebody else could say the reason there was a decrease in chickens crossing that day is because the most important factor is the wind out of the north. And somebody else can come along and say, look, there was no real decrease because these chickens crossed the road in the truck, and that counts too. So it's still debatable, and they all have these facts with air quotes that are backing them up and these sources, but none of them are less true. It's just about deciding importance and citing sources to create facts. Does that make any sense? I hope so. Okay, let's go back to everything is debatable. So the reason that we end up having thesis statements is to, just like with chickens crossing the road, to end up asserting what our particular angle is, what our particular answer is, if everything is relatively subjective. Subjective meaning I have picked this source. I am saying that this is the most important. I am giving you this evidence that my angle is correct. Let's look at this in pie crust recipes. So pie crust is highly debated between bakers. My brother is a baker and he is obsessed with how to make the best crust. There are a bunch of different ways to do it. Hopefully you have somebody in your family or community who obsess about who makes the best pie crust. And here is one of them. Buttery, flaky pie crust. I'm sure an all recipes ad will pop up in just a moment. Buttery, flaky pie crust. 4,000 made it, 1,000 reviewed it, and of those 1,000 reviews, it's almost at 5 stars, so it's pretty good. Here we have some evidence. Whoop. Here we have some evidence, right? We have some sources. We have some primary sources saying, whoa, buttery, flaky pie crust was fantastic. Butter makes this buttery, flaky recipe the perfect crust for your pie. Is this objective? Does it need to be? Is there any reason that this would have to be completely objective to be fact? Or has somebody just taken a specific thesis statement and backed it up with evidence and sources? Here are the sources and the citation and primary. We can witness that this is delicious, buttery, flaky pie crust and this angle. Butter makes this buttery, flaky recipe the perfect crust for your pie, right? So the thesis statement here is that butter is what makes this so amazing. Does it in any way matter if this is completely subjective, if this fact, this answer, this thesis statement is backed up by all of this evidence and sources, right? Let's look. Oh, there's the recipe. There's the all recipes ad. Please also tell your speech teachers that I'm doing this whole thing with gum in my mouth. Okay, this one has a different thesis statement. How to make vodka pie crust. Ooh, how you like that for sources? Looks pretty good. Seems like they've created a fact with that sourcing. Pie crust from scratch can feel intimidating. Cool, all the ads. Pie crust from scratch can feel intimidating and time-consuming without a guarantee of success. Yet one ingredient can deliver a crisper, flakier, finished crust over time: vodka. What? Look at this astounding introduction paragraph, as you will have eventually in yours, and this thesis statement. Are they saying that butter is the most important ingredient? No, their argument, not necessarily super combative, is debatable, and it is still the same level of subjective or objective. They have taken a thesis statement and they have found sources like this delicious picture to back themselves up and establish it as facts with air quote, finger quotes around fact. And then they're also going to explain it, right? So notice that this one doesn't just have a thesis statement. This author is going to take their thesis statement and turn it into a fact that is debatable by backing themselves up with tons of text and images, right? So this is backed up with sources and citations. So it doesn't matter if this is objective or subjective. Capisci? Okay, this one is with lard. This one here that you can click on. Using lard makes crust even flakier than using butter. I would argue that as a baker, this one has some downsides. Butter's a little bit harder to work with than lard, but butter does taste much better in this subjective opinion. I guess we have to collect some data about the flavors inside of a pie crust. And this one you can see talks about using a food processor, that you don't have to do this old-fashioned auntie or grandma hand motion with forks and knives or a special pastry tool that cuts the butter in for you. Just go ahead and pulse in the food processor. Now notice, none of those are objectively incorrect. They're very subjective, but they're put in the category of fact by their sources and citations. They're still all debatable. And none of the above take the broad statement of pie crust is yummy, the undebatable pie crust exists, or just this one is the best with no specificity. They all have an angle, and they declare it. No baker is objective about their favorite pie crust. All they can do is disclose the pros and cons of their answer about what makes each great or terrible or mediocre, and then they give you their sources and citations, which is a lot of those pictures and things. And if they didn't declare their angle, they would still have one. If we only looked at the ingredients or as many instructions as would fit on a note card, they would still have an angle. They would still have an argument. They would still have a main point. It just wouldn't be as disclosed or declared or answered or revealed or clear or even understandable. If we only had a note card for each of these 4 pie crust recipes that just listed ingredients and super basic instructions, this one would still be depending on butter. This one would still be depending on vodka. This one would still be depending on lard, and this one would still be depending on the food processor. The bias doesn't disappear when the angle isn't declared. It just makes it harder to understand and harder to write about. That's why we develop thesis statements, and that's why we make them so easy to find, so that it's clear we understand what we are saying. Our bias is not an accident. I think butter makes the best pie crust, and here's my evidence, right? Not accidentally, this pie crust exists. I have no idea why it's great, right? Without the thesis statement, we fall into this broad, undebatable, no reasons, no logic, no spelling it out, no explaining, and it gets very confusing very quickly, especially when you're going fancier than you are for pie crust, which takes us to thesis statements in college level papers instead of in pie crust. UW. Let's look at some badgers developing a thesis statement. Keep in mind that not all papers require thesis statements. Boo! Hiss! I feel comfortable booing and hissing the badgers, as I am a badger. If in doubt, please consult your instructor for assistance. Always put a thesis statement. Always put a thesis statement, even if it's for a professor or an employer who doesn't recognize that they're asking you for one. They are, right? They're asking you for your recommendations, your take on something, or even if it's just a biology exam about mitosis and meiosis, you will still have a thesis statement about how the two are different or what makes mitosis unique as a cellular process. Okay, so when in doubt, in fact, do have a thesis statement, even if they haven't asked for it. It makes you much fancier. Also, we got it about the cookies. Okay. A thesis statement makes an argumentative assertion about a topic. It states the conclusions that you have reached about your topic, right? So one baker decided that lard was the most important. One baker decided that vodka was the most important. But it's there. They have come to some answers. They are no longer in this vague, nebulous, undescribable, non-debatable situation of saying, pie crust exists, or this one is the best and I have no idea why. They have made an assertion. They have given their answers. A thesis statement makes a promise to the reader about the scope, purpose, and direction of your paper. It's the most basic map you can have. If you read a recipe titled buttery flaky pie crust, it's not going to be a surprise when you get to the ingredients list and there's butter, right? So it effectively gave a little roadmap. Hey, we're headed towards using butter in this way. Or hey, maybe you should dust off your food processor. The title of this very clearly indicates that you are about to use your processor, right? So the title and the thesis statement of these pieces aims them directly at the rest of the paper, and you don't in those recipes then find something about orange zest that wasn't included up front. There are not tons of surprises later. It's a declaration of the path that the reader is about to take, and it sticks to it. A thesis statement is focused and specific enough to be proven within the boundaries of your paper. I'm so happy that they have quotes around proven, because remember, nothing is objective, right? This is just your angle, but the way it becomes a fact with quotes is by you making it specific enough and finding the evidence for it, right? You make it into a backed up statement with your evidence. We don't have to have things objective to back them up. We can back them up better if they're not framed as falsely objective, like pie crust exists. False. I mean, false in terms of that you wouldn't be able to back it up. You would either have no evidence or all of the evidence, which is just as bad. Okay. It is generally located near the end of the introduction. Sometimes, in a long paper, the thesis statement will be expressed in several sentences or in an entire paragraph. Try to avoid having your entire paragraph of introduction be a thesis statement. It just gets really long and wordy and will lead to papers and topics that are so nitpicky that you hate them more than an average research paper. And this near the end of the introduction paragraph is referring to MLA style and a lot of APA style. There is another popular style that business and law and history tend to use that is called Chicago style, and they punch it right up front. They splat the thesis statement first thing, and then they explain it to you. But in MLA and APA, you will, in fact, find the thesis statement near the end of the introduction paragraph. A thesis statement identifies the relationships between the pieces of evidence they're using to support your argument. Remember when I said that the chicken crossing the road should have the direction of an increase or a decrease added to it? That's what this is saying. It's not just saying this lump of data exists and here are the causes of that data, but that you would say, I can also describe this data. There was an increase, there was a decrease, they stayed the same, it was drastic, it was mild, it's not a big deal, it is a big deal, etc. Right? That you're starting to say, not just here's this clump of data. You're saying there's a relationship here. There's something important that helps me answer all of those complex research questions. Okay. Bear with me. I am not sure if this one or the second one is the best to look at right now. I actually picked this because I love Purdue and their online writing lab. Purdue OWL is fantastic. Determine what kind of paper you're writing. Please, for the love of everything, always have these three together. If you are trying to analyze something without an angle, it's probably like a pie crust recipe with no thesis statement. The angle is still there. You're already preferring butter or lard or vodka and you just didn't say so. So if you're making something analytical, please, for the love of everything, also acknowledge your argument, right? The thesis statement. And expository, I mean, don't write a fiction novel, but you're still going to have to explain yourself. No research paper should be without the element of explaining, analyzing the divisions that you've made, or declaring your angle on the divisions and analysis that you performed. Okay. Your thesis statement should be specific. Yes. A thesis statement usually appears at the end of the first paragraph. Correct. Your topic may change as you write, so you may need to revisit your thesis statement to reflect exactly what you have discussed in the paper. Yes. I love OWL for this reason. They are going to remind us that great, you start with a strong thesis statement, you find an amazing source later that disagrees a little bit, you can go back in and tweak, right? It would be perfectly acceptable for somebody to start writing a pie crust recipe that favors butter. They love the flavor of it. It can be made flaky, but then they discover how difficult it is to cut in butter, and they decide to switch to a recipe about butter being half the oil because it has a delicious flavor, and lard being half the oil because it's much easier to cut in. That would be fine. You can start with a strong thesis statement and then amend it as you go along. It's really important that you do that. It'll keep you on the right track, following the best sources, if you let yourself start with something strong and then keep tweaking it as you go along to match. All right. Okay. Developing strong thesis statements. Again with Purdue, it must be debatable. Here is an example of a thesis statement that is not debatable. Pollution is bad for the environment. This thesis statement is not debatable. First, the word pollution implies that something is bad or negative in some way. It is included in the definition. Furthermore, all studies agree that pollution is a problem. They simply disagree on the impact it will have or the scope of the problem. No one would reasonably argue that pollution is unambiguously good. Not even Ron Swanson, right? So this is completely undebatable. This is the equivalent of pie crust exists, right? You would either spend every waking moment for the rest of your life trying to find all of the sources, or you would have none. You would have none, and you would just say, hey, this is what the dictionary says, or you would try to find all of the sources and you would fill an entire library with all of your sources. So we just consider this non-debatable, completely undebatable, and move on. Pie crust exists, the pollution is bad for the environment. No, don't go there. Example of a debatable thesis statement. At least 25% of the federal budget should be spent on limiting pollution. A little bit better. It is debatable, but I want you to look at, is this specific enough? Right? It's debatable. You know, we could say 50%, we could say 75%, we could say 10%, we could say 1%. But which federal budget are we talking about? And which pollution are we talking about? And how is it going to be limited? Are we talking about having cars checked for exhaust before they can be registered each year? Are we talking about that we're going to limit pollution by pouring money into new energy technologies? There is so much to this that is not specified, that this is debatable, but it is not specific enough. Okay. Another example of a debatable thesis statement. America's anti-pollution efforts should be focused on privately owned cars. Again, debatable, right? Easily debatable. You could say the exact opposite. You could say, should not focus on privately owned cars. There are thousands and thousands of spin-offs from this, so it's very debatable, but again, it's not very specific. A thesis statement needs to be narrow. Drug use is detrimental to society. Why is this too broad, even though it's debatable? Which drugs are we talking about? Is the author talking about illegal drug use, recreational drug use, or all uses of medication in general? Second, in which ways are drugs detrimental? Is drug use causing deaths? Is drug use changing the moral climate or causing the economy to decline? Finally, what does the author mean by society? Is the author referring only to America or to the global population? Does the author make any distinction between the effects on children and adults? So you see what I'm saying. This is debatable, but it's not narrow enough, just like the ones above. Example of a narrow or focused thesis. Illegal drug use is detrimental because it encourages gang violence. This is the tip of a narrowing iceberg. I would love it if, as we go through this paper writing process online, you would say which illegal drug is detrimental in which area, which age group, which community, which state, which nation, because it encourages gang violence. And you would probably have to end up defining gang. You would have to end up defining violence. And you could still narrow this much more. Narrow debatable thesis 1. At least 25% of the federal budget should be spent on helping upgrade businesses to clean technologies, researching renewable energy sources, and planting more trees in order to control or eliminate pollution. So much better. And it is a better roadmap as well. It doesn't say which federal budget, which is a downer. Which federal budget are we talking about? There are a bunch of them. At least 25% of the federal budget should be spent on helping upgrade businesses to clean technologies. There is going to be an entire subsection of this paper without a titled heading. It's just going to have nice transitions between the paragraphs about businesses being helped by the federal budget to clean technologies. What are the clean technologies and what will the help be and what will the upgrades be? Researching renewable energy sources. How is the federal government is going to be covered? How is the federal government going to research renewable energy sources? Which energy sources and how is the money going to be allocated? And probably definition of renewable. And planting more trees in order to control or eliminate pollution. They're probably going to have to, again, define how the federal budget is going to account for this. How the planting is going to happen. Is it going to be contracted out? Is it going to be at the state level, at the county level? We're going to have to define more trees and which kind of trees. And probably there's going to be some talk of which trees best control and eliminate pollution. Or narrow debatable's thesis statement number 2. America's anti-pollution efforts should focus on privately owned cars because it would allow most citizens to contribute to national efforts and care about the outcome. Notice again how much this could work as a roadmap for laying out that paper. Okay, back to this soapbox. I am at this point going to switch to describing the exact assignment that my students and I are going to be working on this semester, but I do have some general pitches. Is that if you follow these tips and tricks to asking yourself complex questions, to focusing on explaining the content so it shows that you understand the information, and to having a really nice thesis statement, that you won't end up writing an entire book. You won't end up writing an entire chapter. You'll have something that is nice and narrowed down to, we should plant these trees in this county of Wisconsin in order to mitigate pollution in these exact ways. Then you will not end up writing a chapter or a book or an entire library. So a lot of college papers get longer as you proceed through classes, and I actually pitch this as a perk, not another terrible revelation that we humans have had too much of recently. It is much, much harder to be concise and cover the same information than it is to give yourself the space to explain yourself better. If you have to cover the exact same amount of concepts in 2 pages, or 3, or 5, it is much harder than doing it in 6 or 8 or 10. You would still have to cover the same complexity of information. You would just have less space to do it. Having a longer paper means that you pick a topic that you actually care about, that you actually are allowed to get in there and obsess about something that is important to you or that is important to your field of study, and actually get in there and deal with the nitty-gritty. You do not have to cut it off at what fits on a cheat sheet or, study card for an exam. The other thing is that if your paper isn't complex enough to require a little bit more space, you're probably not writing at capacity. You're probably not thinking at critical capacity. If you are doing all of your critical thinking, if you have picked a topic that's really interesting to you, if you are understanding something really, really well and it's still short, that means that you're not making it complex enough, that you can handle more. If things are still turning out way too short, maybe you have the world's best concise writing style, or maybe you're not letting the information be understood as complexly as you should. This will also be my pitch for outlines. If you don't have enough complexity that you would like to help your human brain out by making an outline to remember it all, you're probably not working at capacity. You're probably working under complexity. English nerds always mean double spaced. So, 6 to 8 pages or 8 to 10 pages double spaced is not nearly as bad as you think so in the first place. Also, please actually do the double spacing, not just because it fits the page length nicely. It makes it easier to read on screens, which is a lot of what we're all doing now. Or if you're going to print it, maybe on scratch paper that's already been used, maybe double-sided, maybe you'll reuse it as scrap paper after you print it. It's much easier not just to read, but to leave comments on something that is double-spaced. All right, and lastly, if you are making a research paper in the middle of a plague, you don't have to worry so much. As humans face this giant, enormous, tragic struggle, our standards for everything online are going to have to be a little bit lower. If you manage to have higher standards, because that helps you cope with the human stressors of writing a research paper during the plague, that is fine as well. Okay, for my students, here is the assigned paper for the semester. This particular one happens to be for spring 2020, English 104 at Viterbo. Even though most of my assignments are worth 10 points, and you'll have lots of 10-point assignments in each unit building up to the final research paper, the final draft is worth 100 points, because otherwise I was finding that nobody was turning in the final draft because it wasn't worth any more than all the other drafts. So to get a final draft in here, I'm going to give you points for building up to your paper all along the way, and then 100 points for turning in the final draft, which will be due during our final exam period. If this semester I can extend it, if for financial aid and success and data and all the reasons that universities want your grades in earlier, I will suck it up and force us to rapidly create an online research paper. But if I can extend the digital copy of your research paper being due on Moodle past our final time, I will. The more time, the better, I think, when we have to spend all of our time communicating instead of just glancing at each other and casually discussing questions. This is going to be a 6 to 8 page research paper. And again, it would be much harder to cover the same level information in fewer pages, unless you have the world's most perfected, concise writing style, which is really rare, so don't lean on that. Try to let yourself use 6 to 8 pages to explain something that's important to you. I'm letting you pick your topic. If you have something that you are already obsessing about, if you already want to just really nerd out and fall down the rabbit hole of a certain obsession that you already have and just find the best sources for it, fantastic. Go for it. I think that it is very valuable to just follow something you already obsess about and formalize it. There was a student who, in a technical reporting class, in a 10-page paper, he asserted all of these ways that the little kids hockey league for which he coached should update their data tracking and wins and losses statistics. And he did it so well, and he was ready to send it off to his little kids hockey league where he was a coach. And they had just passed an amendment doing exactly what he was arguing for. And that's how well he knew his topic. And that is how well he had found correct information, was that by the time he went to send it to his colleagues, they were like, yes, we are already doing that. You are spot on correct. So take this as an opportunity to jump right in to one of your favorite topics and find the really cool, complex, correct information. And your angle on it, right? He clearly had a thesis statement that was very much about, here's how we should track wins and losses to make it fair to all these little kids. His thesis statement was very implicated. And easily identifiable. You'll have to reword it a bunch of times throughout your paper and keep referencing back to it. It is, the North Star of your paper. So don't bury the lead. Either the first or last sentence of your introduction paragraph, and it will be debatable and it will be specific. It will help you write your research paper and not write a chapter, a book, or a library, which you should do someday, but not for this paper. Introduction paragraph and conclusion paragraph, not entire subsections of a paper, right? There will be times when you get to the research publication level of your career where you will have an entire section that is multiple pages long called an introduction or called the conclusion or called methods. Not this time. This time you have to have an introduction paragraph and a conclusion paragraph, but nothing that is multiple pages or multiple paragraphs that comes with headers and subsections. Smooth paragraph transitions and a clear overall flow, outline, and structure. We'll do this via creating outlines and, digitally discussing what the structure of the information should be, and you will not have those little subsection headers that label the subsections of the paper. Instead, you will just go from paragraph to paragraph with smooth transitions, which division and analysis unit will assist with. You have to cite at least 8 credible sources with in-text parenthetical format, at least 4 of them primary. We will cover what in-text parenthetical format means, and we will also cover what a primary source is versus secondary and tertiary. But again, just like page limit, I encourage you to look at this as an asset. I will not cut you off from sources and say, nope, pick only your 2 best sources. No. You get as many sources as you need to illustrate your point of obsession. A lot of papers find that they like to use more than 8. Not everybody. My apologies. But most of you will find your job is easier proving your point with more than 8 sources. Again, think to the pie crust, and if you would make the pie crust that was reviewed with 1 delicious looking photo, or where like 20 people had posted delicious looking photos of that pie crust, right? Those extra sources help prove your point. Regardless of which style you use, you must have a bibliography or works cited page. The MLA style, the Modern Language Association style, is preferred by basically every English department ever, but is also almost exclusively the style used, only in English. So I can absolutely do MLA. It's likely the one you learned in high school. No problem. We can make it relatively functional. That said, if you know in your career that you're going to use APA, American Psychological Association, or Chicago style, which I said is business and legal and history, or if you know you're going to use American Medical Association, AMA, or slightly modified, like I know dietitians use modified AMA, I can justify with you on a case-by-case basis not writing an MLA. If you at this point want to shift into the writing style of your career field, you can, which would mean that, for example, in Chicago style, your parenthetical references, the sources that you put in parentheses inside your paper, would instead be endnotes for this paper. Or that if you want to do APA, the formatting inside the parentheses is only a smidgen different. But it's up to you. If you already know MLA like the back of your hand and want to do it, great. If you are already fluent in APA or Chicago and want to stay there, great. If you want to use this as a point to shift into whatever your career field is going to use, fantastic. But pick MLA, APA, AMA, or Chicago, or show me which journal you hope to be published in someday that uses a modified version of those. You let me know. You have to have a coherent title, but you won't have to have a cover page. Just like we're not going to have long subsections in here, we're also not going to have long, cover page formalities. You have to write this in the formal third person perspective. We will no longer, by the final draft, be saying I, you, or we. We will only be speaking in answers in the formal third person. So he, she, they, lots of proper nouns. And you will not be asking interesting questions like, what is pollution after all? No, you'll be saying this is the most problematic pollution and this is what we should be doing about it. So by all means, ask yourself all the questions at the beginning. By the end, you will be giving all the answers. Demonstrate a basic mastery of grammar and punctuation. That is to say that we're going to worry a lot more about the content, and then at the very end, let's do, you know, some human eyeballs on papers to fix spelling and punctuation and grammar and things. But let those be an afterthought. 12 point, really standard font. Times New Roman is a really nice one to use. Some standard margins, and we can see these a mile away. So it's not just that we have giant databases that we can spot check for plagiarism and copying and things. It is also just that we're really used to looking at pages full of text, and we can tell what the spacing is and what the font is. And you know, it's not a huge deal if at some point you're like, oh gosh, it's so close. I just want to give myself just a little bit bigger margin, or I don't have Times New Roman in my software, or, you know, 11-point font just this one time. But we can tell, and either we'll let it slide because you earned it by having a really amazing paper, or we'll call you on it because it's really obvious. So you're not getting away with any sneaking. You may get away with it if you've justified it, but in general, just stick with the really average formatting for a research paper. Okay, there you have it. This is just the first unit. I am going to go make and start uploading the others. It is turning out to be hilarious and some situational comedy and almost impossible to get all this going unexpectedly. But we can do it. We can be flexible. I'm not just op-ed from the show community. Okay, hang in there.